I took this photo and edited it with Luminar Neo, and in this tutorial I'll share my process with you so you can start getting results like this as well. For this edit I will only be using Luminar Neo, the base editing program. I won't be using any plugins, extensions. As great as all of that stuff is, I want you guys to know that you can absolutely create fantastic edits without those additional tools. So if you're not on the subscription model or haven't purchased extensions, don't worry, you can still create great results. Let's get into the edit. So I was playing around with this raw photo yesterday and ended up with this edit here. It's something similar that we're going to end up with. So if we jump into the edits tab, you can see all of the tools that I've applied to this, but we are going to start from the beginning. But rather than come in and actually reset those adjustments, what I'm actually going to do is create a brand new version of this. So I'm going to right click and come to Show in Explorer. I'm now pressing Ctrl+C to copy this file and then Ctrl+V to paste it. And now if I close that window down and hop back into Luminar Neo, nothing's updated because I'm not actually in the folder that houses these photos. I added this in as a single image, so I can just come in and add that new photo as well. And now we can see we have the original photo and my edited version next to each other. Over in the info panel here, you can see that I shot this at f8 at 1/400th of a second. I was handheld because I didn't want to be setting up a tripod in the middle of the road. I'm at ISO 200 and I shot this on a 70-200 telephoto lens, but I was as wide as I can go on that lens at 70mm. So let's jump into the editing section and see what we can do. The first thing that we always want to do is to come into Develop Raw, and I'm going to apply a camera matching profile. And I like to work with camera flat because as a starting point, not only does it get our colors more accurate, but it also unlocks more dynamic range for us to play with. So now it's just a case of working the contrast and getting this photo looking more like I want it to. Usually that's a case of dropping down the highlights and boosting the shadows slightly, while at the same time making sure we still have a nice level of contrast. I do like my black and white points to start right at the very edge of the histogram, and we can see that by pressing these little icons here so that when we drop our blacks down and we go too far, we get to see a little warning. The same with the whites, when we push those too far, we get a red pixel warning as well. And I've gone into detail in a previous video as to why I'm not a big fan of actually shifting the black and white sliders. And in a nutshell, that is basically because the brightness values, when you move these, are not actually redistributed in a uniform manner. They're actually bunched at the top end when you move the whites, and also bunched towards the bottom when you move the blacks. Basically, it's a biased manipulation of the curve. What I would prefer to do is actually come into the curve section itself and actually grab the point that represents the white point and the point that represents the black point, and actually shift those over until we start to see those little red warnings that we're starting to get here on the snow on the mountain, and just make sure that we're only just starting to see those teeter in, and then do the same with the black point as well and shift that over just until we start to see those little blue warnings appear. Something like that looks pretty good, and now we have a linear redistribution of all these brightness values in our photo rather than that bunching, pinching that we saw previously when we actually moved the white and the black sliders. I'll usually shoot all my work on the camera auto setting, and the as shot for this, I feel like the camera just hasn't really nailed it. I would much prefer this to be a warmer photo. So I'm going to boost the temperature up and also grab the tint slider and just play with that. Now, if you've been staring at a photo for a long time, sometimes it's hard to actually see whether you have more of a green or magenta cast. And in that case, what I'd recommend you do is actually just push that slider all the way left and right so you can really see the influence, and then it's easier just to start honing in on the sweet spot where you think that you've got that balance right, and I'm pretty happy with that. Usually I'll be boosting up the vibrant slider before I start working with the saturation, because the algorithm that drives the vibrant slider is a more intelligent and intuitive way of boosting colors. Colors that are already oversaturated, it won't push them quite as aggressively as what the saturation slider does. However, the vibrant slider is also designed not to increase orange colors too aggressively, and that is designed to look after skin tones when you shoot portraits, so you can increase the saturation of colors in clothing but not the skin tones. However, I actually want the oranges to be boosted up in this case because I want that lovely rich orange color through the landscape. So in this case, contrary to the way I normally work, I'm going to lean more heavily on the saturation slider. So I'll just double click the vibrant slider to reset it, and I'm going to grab the saturation and start to move that up. It's really important that we get settings such as white balance, contrast, our exposure, and the black and white point set correctly during the develop raw stage, also with the correct camera matching profile applied. And the reason for that is it's only at this stage of our edit that we're able to access all of that lovely rich raw data in the file. So we want to get that dialed in as best we possibly can with maximum contrast, maximum dynamic range, and as accurate color balance as we can at this point. And from there we're able to build our more creative decisions on top of a really strong foundational edit. Okay, let's zoom in and check the quality of the file. Okay, let's just come down here. Maybe we don't want to push that black slider quite as far as that, just so we're not destroying any data in those darkest pixels. But as I scroll down here, we now have access to the sharpen module. So now we have the ability to apply sharpening to our photo, and we don't want to push this too far. While I do actually really like the sharpening algorithm inside Luminar Neo, we don't want to be too aggressive with it. We don't want to start seeing halos. Like if you see, if I push this to 100 with a massive radius, you can see that we're starting to get halos and those clipping warnings introduced where the mountain meets the sky. Overall, that is not a good look. We've gone way too far with that. So I'm just going to double click that to reset it. And in terms of the sharpness, I think somewhere low around 37, that's fine. And of course, yes, we have an AI denoise tool, but of course we've still got the option for standard luminosity reduction. And if I push that all the way, you can see that we've lost all of that noise in the sky. We don't want to push this too aggressively because things will start to look a little plasticky. However, a little can go a long way. Perhaps somewhere around 30 is a good compromise between our photo being too noisy and going too far the other way where we make it look really plasticky and lose any semblance of that grain that actually makes it look photographic. Okay, in terms of optics, let's have a look here. Auto distortion corrections, when we turn that on, providing we are working on a raw file, Luminar is going to check its database against the lens with which your photo was taken and make any corrections for any lens distortion that you may have. But in my case, do you know what? I don't think it's noticeable enough to rewarp the photo. So I'm going to keep my pixels authentic to what was captured on the sensor and turn that off. However, chromatic aberration and fringing, which often appears around the edge of frames, it's not a bad idea just to make sure that those are checked. And in terms of an initial raw edit, I think that's all we need to do. So let's just have a quick preview of where we came from and where we've got to. So here's our before. Here's our after. Powerful changes already just with the develop raw tool. I'm now going to press J on the keyboard, which will get rid of those warnings there. Next up, I want to make sure the sky's looking good. And one of the things I'd like to do is actually bring down the brightness level while at the same time making sure that the clouds stay nice and impactful. So as you guys may know, inside Enhance AI, there's a specific tool called Sky Enhancer. And if I crank that all the way up, you can see exactly what it does, which, as with all the tools, 100% is way too much. But we may want to just tickle in a little bit of this. However, you can see that as I push this up, things are getting oversaturated, and I'm not really in love with processing that it's applying in that transitional area between the cloud and the sky. It's not looking particularly good to me. So let's just reduce that quite far. We're going to close that down. I think a better way to actually deal with this is utilizing the curves tool inside of Develop. So what I'm going to be able to do is just bring down the exposure by grabbing that curve slider, and you can see that already we're getting a pretty similar effect in the sky to what that slider was doing before. So we may need to do just a little bit more work to this. However, first of all, we want to make sure that we're talking only into the sky. So from the adjustment section, I'm switching over to masking. That's going to allow me to come into my mask AI. That will analyze my scene. And once it's done that, I'm going to be able to select the sky, click on that. And as you can see, it's done a pretty good job. We do have a little bit of bleed over the snow here, and we've also lost that mountain there. But for all intents and purposes, this is close enough. So I can jump back to my adjustments now. And as I toggle the before and after preview, you can see that we are pretty much just talking into the sky. So we're free to now work with the contrast and the brightness level. And so I want to make sure that my clouds are nice and white. So I'm going to just bring that white point over, and I'm just going to start bringing down the brightness value there. And at the moment, I am purely concerned with the brightness values only, not the over saturation that's going on, because we are working inside of a develop tool here, so that allows us access to the curves but also to the saturation as well. So I'm going to grab this and just see, by reducing that saturation through the sky, whether we can get the best of both worlds. So by using the develop tool with a localized mask that allows us just to speak to the sky only, we can control the contrast and the brightness level in the sky, and then that increase in saturation that inevitably occurs when we increase contrast, we're able to bring that back using the saturation slider inside the same tool. So that's a win-win. For the next step, let's clean up the image with a bit of cloning. For me, I use cloning as a way just to clean up any distractions that are catching my eye in an image. So we come down to the professional tab, and the very last tool is clone. So currently there are a few things that catch my eye, such as this pole here. I don't mind these ones that are going off further into the distance because they appear much smaller. However, this one here being so much bigger, I find that much more visually distracting. So all I'm going to do is sample just to the side of it so that we can steal the grass from just here, and I'm going to paint it over here. So the first click sets our source. That is effectively saying borrow pixels from here, and then wherever I paint, it's going to take those pixels and paint them over the top. So as you can see, we're borrowing from the left hand side where the source was set, and we're painting directly over the top, and now it's gone. So here's our little road marker, and here it is gone, before and after. Now I'm going to hold the space bar so that I can drag and navigate over to the other side and do exactly the same on this side. So I'm just going to steal a little area here and start painting that over the base and move up. And if we need to match an area of distinctive detail, such as this wooden fence line here, what I like to do is, rather than just randomly picking a bit by the side and trying to paint over, what I will do is actually find the same repeating pattern. So we have another pillar just here, and then I will find from the source of the corner of that a distinctive point, so the corner, and bring that corner over here, click once, and now I can paint down, and so I know that I've literally got the side of that pillar, and now I can borrow into the grass to the right hand side. I can borrow a little more grass there, doesn't matter where from because we don't need to be as precise as we were with the pillar. And I think I've just replicated a little bit of that other bit there. Okay, that's fine. Let's zoom back out, and no one's ever going to know that that was there. That's absolutely fine. And then if we see other little bits that are just catching our eye and it's not going to really destroy the photo by taking it out, then I recommend we do that. So we've got this little marking on the road here. I think I'm just going to remove that. I'm a big fan of just keeping things nice and clean in your photo. So that little road sign that was just popping up there wasn't really adding anything to the photo. So by taking it out, we're not losing anything. We're just creating a much cleaner environment for our viewer to look at. And you can also see that we've got a few dust spots from my sensor here, and absolutely yes, Luminar Neo has a tool where we can say remove dust spots, and that's a fantastic feature. However, I'm already using the clone tool, so I might as well just sample a little bit of the sky to the side of where each of these little dust spots is and just paint over really quickly. Don't have to wait for Luminar to do that processing. I'm quite happy to do that myself. Now, I was talking about a cleaner visual environment for our viewer to look at, and part of that I did in my original edit, if I jump back here, you'll see that the cloud formation in this one that I edited here is actually slightly different. And that was because I got rid of some of the clouds at the top of the frame, like this one here centrally. I just removed it because I just found it a little bit distracting. And I also got rid of some of the cloud at the edge because I don't like really bright things at the edge of my frame. As you know, the viewer's eye will go to the brightest parts of a picture first, and so I don't like having a bright element right at the corner of my frame because it brings the viewer's eye away from this lovely rolling landscape through the center that's really nicely lit, and it draws your attention up here. So to minimize it, we don't need to get rid of the cloud completely. Minimizing it might be the way forward. So I'm just going to reactivate the clone tool that we had before, and I'm just going to sample different areas of the sky to remove bits of the cloud that I no longer want to see. And so I might just get rid of that part there, and rather than working with a strength of 100 and saying, hey, cover this up completely, what I'm going to do is actually set my strength to 50 so that I can build this up slowly. So basically every time I click and paint, I'm going to be applying 50% of the effect. Now what you want to be careful of, you can see here if I paint this, I'm getting a line down here, and that is because I'm sampling from over this side and I'm meeting the edge of my photo. absolutely not what we want. So I just did that deliberately to show you. So I'll just press Ctrl-Z on my keyboard to undo, and I'm going to come in just a little bit further right in the middle of this nice blue patch that's nice and clear, so I know that anywhere I paint I've got a little bit of leeway left and right to just paint over. So I'm just going to come in, resample, and I've done the same. I've gone too high there. You don't want to do that, so click down where you've got plenty of space around, and I know that if I start higher than that where I'm painting it in, as long as I come down, I'm only going to be adding more sky. And so now if we toggle the clone tool and we look up where the sky is, I'll zoom up here. So now if we look at the corner of the frame, we've introduced more blue, so that cloud is just a little bit less distracting around that very corner. So this is what it looked like before, very bright, very white. And now I've just eased that back a little bit by introducing more blue. It's just less of a visual distraction at that corner of the frame. Okay, next up I want to look at a mismatch of colour balance that we've got going on. You'll see in the foreground where the road is actually blue, and that is because that area is actually lit by the ambience of the blue sky bouncing down, so it's just a big blue fill light. You can also see that on the sides of the mountains in the shadows there. It's very, very blue. So how much of that I remove from the mountains I'm not sure, but I definitely want to get a more neutral grey looking road. So let's deal to that. So as you can see, our road is currently very, very blue. If I zoom in all the way, it is absolutely blue. So what I might do is just leave this zoomed in, and that's going to be a bit easier for me to make my adjustments. So I could come into the color section here and just grab the temperature slider and start moving these and the tint until I get to like a neutral grey. I want to work with the temperature because I don't just want to desaturate this, because that's going to take away all the colour from the surrounding areas as well. I'm only interested in the road at the moment. Obviously, another way to do this, if I just reset this, is to actually jump into the colour tool itself, and that's going to allow us to specifically come into the hue of the blue and either shift that around. That's not what we want to do. We want to come into the saturation of the blue and just pull that saturation out. But as you can see, it's actually desaturating so much of the environment around it. Reason being, believe it or not, this grassy tussock that looks so yellow where the sun's hitting it, it's so influenced by that blue light of the sky. So that's not really what we want to do in this case. So let's close that down again and come back into the develop section. And I think the best way to do this is just by working with the temperature slider. While I'm making these adjustments, I'm only keeping my eye on the foreground area. I'm not concerned with all the craziness that's going on in the background and the sky, because again, we can just come in and mask this only where we want it. And there's several different ways we could do that, but I think the easiest would be to apply a linear gradient. And so that's going to allow us to say, hey, wherever we draw this mask in, affect everything that's really red, that's going to be 100%, and that's going to taper through to 50% in this central line here, and then 0 up here. So all we'll need to do is actually align this with the shadow line that we have going on the road, and a slight transition between the two. You know, I think that's going to look better than if we actually make this very abrupt and try and get it to match perfectly. So let's just apply this. This is what I don't think is going to work. So I'm just going to close that down. And if we jump into the edit section so that we can see the before and after of this, it's not too bad actually. It's a little better than I thought it was going to be, but we are starting to get oversaturation just where this shadow area meets that, and we had that little gradation of the mask overlapping. And so what I'd like to do is just come back in. I'm just going to clear that mask and go again with a new linear gradient, drag that over, and this time I'm just going to create a larger transitional area. Okay, let's come back and have a look at that. Before and after, that transition area is much smoother now, and I think that looks much better. Now you'll notice that in our edit stack, we actually have a develop and a color tool that we never even used. If I jump in here, there's no actual changes that we made here because we reset that blue slider. That was what we were playing around with, reset it, but it still appears in our edit stack. And unfortunately, because we made a change, even though we reset it, it still ends up in this edit section. And so to keep our working space nice and clean, we come in and delete that. The same for this develop tool as well. That was the first one where I started playing around with the color slider, but then I reset it all, but lo and behold, it appeared here. So we want to just get rid of that and keep things nice and clean in our working stack. So we sorted out the color cast on the road, but as you can see, there are still color casts going on in the shadows on the mountains. And whether or not we need to get rid of those, I haven't really made up my mind, because in actual fact, that is the color of the shadow. It is a reflection of the sky. And we don't necessarily need to neutralize it, because we may make the decision that we like the harmony that the blue sky is making with these blue shadow areas. And it's just helping to create more visual consistency through the whole photo. Or we may do, which I think I'm going to do, is actually just reduce it slightly, kind of split the difference. So this time I am going to come into the color tab and the saturation of the blues and just start reducing that. But you can see there's so much blue in the mountain itself that whenever I bring that out, the whole mountain is starting to get desaturated. So I'm not sure I really like that look. I think I'll just drop it just a little bit. And then I'm going to come into the masking, and this time I'm going to say, hey, you know what, let's select only the mountains. Hopefully this is going to work. Let's see what Luminar Neo does. Well, that's pretty good. Okay, now we can jump back and see our before and after, and just watching those blues change in the mountain, before and after, is pretty subtle, but I like that. So we've now got our photo in a pretty good place. I regard this as a technical edit. You know, the color balance is right, the exposure's right, exposure all over the photo is looking good. And it's from this point that I now feel we can go more creative if we want to. If you're more of a purist with your photography, this is where you can kind of leave your photo and say, okay, I'm happy with that, but I like to get a little bit more creative, and I think that's why you're here too. So let's see where we can push this photo, and I might take it in a slightly different direction to what I did with the last one. And I think that's one of the really great things about Luminar Neo and just photo editing in general. It's a creative process, and depending how we feel on any given day and how we're perceiving the work in front of us, we can process that in a very different way. Okay, let's make more of a feature of the road leading our viewer's eye in. And there's a few different ways we could tackle this, but let's see, Relight AI. This is going to allow us to adjust the brightness of the near part of the photo and the far part as well. So what I'd like to do is just darken down the near part and brighten up the road as it goes further into the scene, and that will just help to draw our viewer's eye more into the central part of the photo. So we don't need to do anything too crazy with this. Let's say we're happy with that. And now let's come back up to the develop tool. Such a useful tool. And of course we could play with curves, but in this case, I'm just going to boost up the exposure slightly. One stop will do it. And now I'm just going to brush this effect in. So in the masking section, I'm going to move over to my brush. And now with the paint option, rather than come in and say, hey, I want this to be around the road here, so I'll erase it from everywhere I don't want it. Obviously, it's quicker to work in the positive aspect. So basically I'm saying everywhere I'm going to click and paint, that's where I want this brightening effect. So I'm going to use the bracket keys on my keyboard to reduce the brush size slightly. And I'm going to do this very rough and ready to start with. So I'm just going to release here, and you can see just where I painted that red mask in, we are now revealing, once I've let go, that effect of the brightening. So if I just put a squiggle through here, you can see I'm just brightening that area up. So I'm going to press Ctrl Z and Ctrl Z again, and that's going to get rid of those two paint strokes I made. And this time we're going to do it with just a little bit more subtlety. So I'll put the strength all the way down to 20, and I'm just going to make one pass across the very far end of the shadow. So that's just going to start brightening up the shadow where it's meeting the foreground that's lit up. Sorry, not the foreground, the background where it's lit up. And now I'm just doing a few more passes over the center of the road, just helping to brighten the road up as well. And if you've overbaked it at all, which I think I might have done here, we can just switch to the erase tool and just start to take it away slightly as well. And make sure we're not over brightening the edges, the sides of the photo. And let's just have a toggle of our before and after. And that's just a nice subtle brightening to help lead our viewer's eye in on the road. Okay, let's close that down, and I'd like to intensify where the sun is actually hitting the ground here, and so that's very much in the yellow, so I could come into the color tool and work with that. However, what I think I'd like to do here is work with super contrast. No, we're going to go into color harmony. Let's go into color harmony, and we're going to work with color contrast. So I'm just going to grab this and start pushing the amount up. And now we've got some overexposed land, but as I move the hue up, we should start to see that color intensify, which absolutely it is doing, but it's starting to bleach out our sky. I'm not worried about that because, again, I'm going to mask this in. So I'll just click our before and after to make sure I'm kind of happy with the coloration. Yep, it's not too bad, just sort of through this central area. So I'm going to grab my mask, grab my brush, and again, just paint this in. And I'm just going to make a pass left to right. And we are starting to reintroduce some of that blue in the very end of the road. So I just want to make sure I'm not bleeding over there too much. Okay, let's toggle the before and after. Yeah, it's just adding a nice bit of richness to that color. I still think that we could get a bit more drama in our sky, particularly around the horizon line where it's a little bleached out. So perhaps by using the color harmony tool and jumping into color contrast again, we could do something there. So I'm just going to push the amount to 100 and now move this slider just to see if there's a sweet spot where we're really intensifying the sky. And yes, we are, but I'm not really liking that effect. So I'm just going to reset that. I don't need to use that. Potentially playing around with the color tool could allow us to darken down this area. So the cyans and the blues could be where we want to hit. So I'm going to jump into the luminance, which is obviously just another word for brightness. And I'm just going to grab the blues, bring that down. And you can see I'm finding it very hard to target this area, and that is because there's not actually much color in there at all. Even though it is blue, it's only a slight blue, and that makes it very hard for these tools to really get hold of that pixel information. Whereas, as you can see at the top where we have a more saturated blue, this tool is making a much stronger impact up here. But you know what, as I toggle the before and after, a bit of serendipity. I don't mind this. Like, the effect is too strong, but you know, let's just ease it back and have a little bit of this effect. So something like that. How's that? Before and after? Yeah, sure. Let's go with it. One more thing that we can do to bring the viewer's attention to the center part of the photo, which I think is the most interesting part, we can just work with a vignette. So I'm just going to grab the amount. We don't want to go into positive figures because that brightens the edges. We want to bring this down the other way. This is too strong, obviously, but what I like to do is work pretty heavy so that I can actually see exactly where my vignette is going, and that allows me to make changes to the roundness, things like that, also the feathering, and I can clearly see exactly what's going on, make a decision whether or not I want to brighten the center of the frame or not, and when I'm happy with all of the look, I can come into the amount slider again and now just start to play with that slider, knowing that all of these settings are exactly where I want them. Here's our before, here's our after, before and after. Now, while Luminar Neo's vignette tool is so much better than a lot of other vignette tools out there because it has so much refined control and we can also move the center point of that vignette around, it's still kind of a crude tool. It's kind of like taking a sledgehammer to a little tack. We need more refinement. You may have noticed what's missing from the tool, and that is a mask. So in the bottom corners where we've applied the vignette all the way around, the bottom corners are getting too dark and there's no way for me to remove that effect or reduce intensity in those areas. So let me show you my preferred method for getting a similar result, but it gives us much more refinement. I'm going to do it with, yet again, the develop tool. So let's just reset that vignette tool and close it down. As you can see, it's appeared in our edits, which we don't want, so we'll just throw that in the bin. You can also see that that color harmony that we decided not to use with no adjustments made, that is also in our edit stack, so we'll get rid of that. I'm going to jump into the tool section, not color, but develop, and I'm going to come down to the curves tool. We could just use the exposure slider and drop that down, but I'm trying to get away from crude techniques. The curve tool allows us to be much more refined, so what I like to do around the edges is actually drop the white point as well, but sometimes I will actually bring the black point back up just so that we're not creating, you know, a dark pit of nothingness. By lifting that black point up, we're still darkening things down if we toggle the before and after, but we're still maintaining a bit of detail as well. Again, because we're working with contrast, we've introduced more saturation than was there before, so I'm just going to drop the saturation down just a little bit. Before and after, check I'm happy with that. It's far too strong at the moment, but this is going to allow us to create a more refined vignette. So I'm going to do that with a radial mask and just kind of click around the center of the frame where I'd like to see it. See the brightest part of my photo unaffected, and now I can actually just drag the corners of this ellipse to reshape the vignette. So we can still create an elliptical vignette, position it where we want, Jump back to adjustments, and now you can see we've darkened around the edges while keeping that center part nice and bright. Now, if we feel it's too much, particularly around the bottom corners, like I did with the original vignette, what we can come in and do is actually work with that mask that we've created. So if I come to mask actions and say show, we can see exactly where that's applying that vignette. And now I can come in with the brush, use my erase tool, and with a strength around 1/3, that's fine, and a nice large brush so that we keep things nice and soft, I can just come in and start to erase that effect and the intensity around those side parts. And as well, if you've decided that you like the effect but it's a little bit too strong, what we can do is work with the mask just to drop the mask intensity back just a little bit. So again, I'm just washing 19% of an erase tool over the mask just to take it away just a little bit. If we want to add more in, we can get the paint version and just brush in a little bit of that. So I may just want to darken down this edge a little more, and maybe even just this little area here. Before and after, very hard to see at the moment because we're flip-flopping between the mask. So come back, click the show button so it's no longer visible, and now we can see purely the effect of adding that darkening vignette. Okay, not too much more to do, but one thing I would like to do is just play around with the structure and see whether we can't add a little more interest and ruggedness through here. So I'm going to grab the slider and just start cranking that up and see what it does for us. So of course, some areas of the photo are going to start to fall apart, like the sky around the clouds. That doesn't look very good at all. However, in the mountains, if we toggle our before and after, even in the foreground a little bit too, it's just adding a little bit of interest. So what I want to do is say, do not affect the sky. The easiest way to do that is to come back to our mask AI, click the sky, and currently you'll see that we are affecting only the sky. We want the opposite of that. So come back into the masking section here, and I'm just going to invert that. So I'm saying, give me the opposite of what you just created. So by clicking that invert, now we have not the sky. We have all of the ground and the road. And now I'm going to use the brush just to erase this by about half in a lot of these areas. So particularly around the edges, I want to get rid of all of that. I also want to get rid of it over the road and the grass that was in the shadow as well. I don't want to draw too much attention to this foreground. However, a little bit of interest is quite nice. So again, I'm dropping the strength down and going for one more pass as well, just taking that away. And let's just have a little look at our before and our after. Before and after. That's a nice subtle little pop. And again, if we feel like we're happy with the mask but we want to make a further adjustment, we can just come into the adjustments itself and just bring the amount slider down until we hit a sweet spot where we think it looks good. Let's go for around 70 before and after. From here, there are so many great tools that we could apply to this just to get a more creative look. So I'm just going to have a little play around, see what I like. So we have the dramatic tool here, and that's a really great way to make your photos look more dramatic, surprisingly. However, it can come at a cost. You can see that we're bleaching things out and we're also getting a lot of haloing. So you can see as I bring the local contrast up, that increases that haloing. So if we go the other way, we can kind of get the best of both worlds where we get more contrast but without increasing those halos. Now if I come into the brightness and saturation area, we can just play with this to make sure that we're still happy with the look, because currently the tool actually takes away saturation and I don't really want to reduce too much saturation. I'm enjoying the yellow-blue combination. Have a little look at our before and after. We're too bleached out, but the overall look generally, I don't mind it too much. So I'm going to apply some of this. So again, grabbing that amount slider and just playing with it until we get it into a little sweet spot, before and after. Cool. One of the things I quite like to do to my landscapes, as you know, is once I've added in all of this crunchy detail, and if we zoom in, we can absolutely see all of this rugged detail. And sometimes that can just be a little bit too much visually. It's a little too contrasty, a little too rugged. And a nice way to balance that out is by using either the mystical filter or the glow filters. So by introducing something that just softens your photo up, you can get a nice balance between those two things. My preference is the mystical rather than the glow filter. So I'll just take that away, jump into mystical, and just crank that all the way up so you can see exactly what's going on, and it just feels like it intensifies the photo in so many good ways. So I'm just going to grab the amount slider just like before, bring that down to a point that I feel happy with before and after. Absolutely, we can play with more advanced settings and get this exactly dialed in the way we want it. We can create a smoother look if we boost this smoothness slider all the way up, or a more crunchy look. But the whole purpose of me using this tool is to reduce some of that crunchiness. So I'm just going to smoothen this off. Is that a word, smoothen? We're going to smoothen this off just a little bit. So here's our before, here's our after. Not bad. And the very last step that we apply to our photo edit is the color grading. And we leave this till the end because color is such an integral part of actually fine-tuning our edit along the way. And sometimes you need to leverage the correct colors in your photo to get a specific look that you're after. But with color grading, that's when we're going to apply a global change or manipulation of the colors to give an essence or feel to our photo. So in my previous one, I went for more of a kind of muted sepia warm look, and maybe we'll do the same. But what I would really like to do is enhance the yellow and blue complementary color palette that we've got going on. And so let's have a little play around with the tools and see if we can't achieve that. The easiest way to apply a color grade to your photo is to use the lookup tables. So what we can do is just jump in here, and it's really nice now because we can just mouse over the different effects and see instantly the look that it's creating. So I don't know, let's say we want a bit of Long Beach in this. Let's just add in more contrast, a little bit of color pop. So before and after, yeah, I quite like that actually. But we don't have to just stop there. Another option that I really like for color grading is to actually come into the develop tool again and work with curves, but not in terms of like adding contrast or removing contrast. Let's just double click those points to remove them, but actually come into the color channel itself, and here we're able to actually reduce the color in the highlights. So I'm in the blue channel, and by taking away the blue from the highlights, it's the equivalent of injecting yellow into those highlights. And so because we want to enhance that yellow blue color palette, that is exactly what I'm going to do. I'm just going to bring some of those blues out so the clouds are actually getting more of a yellowy tinge. And we can also grab the shadow slider, and if I lift that up, you can actually see that we're now injecting blue, because as we lift this up, we're adding whatever this channel is, which is blue, we're adding it into the shadows because this is the shadow point on our curve. So let's boost that up, and look, we've just added just a little bit of blue into those shadows. Let's come up and just do the before and after of that tool to check we're happy with that. I'm not convinced. Maybe we'll just ease it back a little bit so we get a little of that effect, but not as much. Before and after, subtlety can go a long way. So as I bring these up side by side, I'm actually quite surprised just how different they are, just how differently I've processed them. The original edit that I did and showed you at the beginning of this video, to me now it looks very contrasty, almost overexposed where the sun is hitting the fields here in the background, whereas in the version that we've just worked on now, I've embraced that yellow blue color harmony much more. I've left it much more saturated and vibrant. And right now I much prefer the version on the left over the version on the right. But the one thing I do prefer on this version on the right is the fact that I did get rid of this little cloud puff just here. I'm finding that just a little bit distracting now, seeing it in the comparative view between the two of them. Do let me know in the comments which one you preferred. Just write left for the version we've just worked on, or right for the version that I previously edited. Okay, Anthony, step away from the edit. I think that's about it. I don't want to push it too far. You've got to know where to draw the line, and often I don't know that. And a good tip for that is just step away from your monitor, take a break, go and get a drink, see your family, whatever. Come back to it with fresh eyes, and usually you'll find that if anything, you've over processed your work. So that could well be what's happened here. If you don't have Luminar Neo yet, absolutely check it out in the link in the description below. And also hopefully this landscape editing masterclass in Luminar Neo has shown you that absolutely you can create and craft a really finessed edit without the need for the additional tools that 𝗨𝘀 so often promotes and suggests that you get. Yes, they are fantastic. Not all of them, but a lot of them are fantastic and worth having. But if you own Luminar Neo outright without those additional plugins and the new generative AI that's coming out, don't panic. It still functions as an excellent photo editor on its own. I'd love to know in the comments what you thought of this much more in-depth photo edit. Was it worth it for you guys? Hope so. This video is a throwback to my much longer photo editing tutorials, and I would love to know what you think in the description of this length of video. Was it worth it for you? I do hope so. If you've enjoyed this edit, you might also enjoy that video right there. And if you haven't subscribed already, click that button there, AT, for more free photography editing tutorials. Thanks a lot, guys. I'll see you in the next video.